They say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life, the moment when everything you've worked for, everything you've dreamed about, finally comes together in one breathtaking promise of forever. But for me, the nightmare began long before I ever walked down the aisle. It began on a quiet evening when I came home earlier than expected and stepped into a scene that shattered my trust in ways I never imagined possible. I still remember the creak of the front door, the faint scent of fresh-cut grass drifting in from outside, and the silence of the house that should have felt familiar, but instead made my skin crawl. Because when I turned the corner into the living room, I found my mother wearing my wedding dress. Not just touching it, not just holding it against her body in some moment of innocent nostalgia. No. She was wearing it fully, the ivory satin hugging her figure, the lace sleeves wrapped around her arms, the train spilling across the floor like a pool of light. She turned slowly toward the mirror that had always stood in our living room, her lips curving into a small, self-satisfied smile, as if she had always been waiting for this exact moment. "Mom?" My voice came out sharp, a mix of disbelief and fear. She didn't jump, didn't stammer, didn't even blush at being caught. Instead, she smoothed her hand down the bodice and tilted her head toward her reflection. "Oh, Emily," she said softly, her tone almost amused. "Don't look so horrified. I was only curious. It's been so long since I've worn something this beautiful. I wanted to remember what it felt like." I felt my breath hitch. "That's my wedding dress," I whispered, the words trembling. "Why would you put it on?" Her eyes flicked toward me, just for a second, and I swear there was something sharp in them, something that made me feel suddenly like a child again, being scolded for questioning her authority. Then she shrugged lightly and looked back at the mirror. "You take everything too seriously. It's just a dress. Besides, look at how well it fits me. The neckline, the waist. Honestly, Emily, it was made for me, not you." The words hit me harder than a slap. My throat tightened, my face burned, and for a moment all I could do was stare at her, at the smug little smile tugging at her lips. "Take it off," I finally said, my voice cracking under the weight of disbelief and anger. "Take it off right now." Her laugh was low, deliberate, as though she had been waiting for that reaction. Slowly, almost theatrically, she slipped the straps off her shoulders, letting the satin fall into a puddle at her feet. She picked it up carefully, folding it with a strange tenderness that made my stomach turn, and then brushed past me without a single apology, carrying the dress in her arms as though it truly belonged to her. When I collapsed into bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood room, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe she had been drinking, maybe she had been lonely, maybe she had simply lost herself in nostalgia. But no matter how I spun it, I couldn't shake the memory of her expression, proud, triumphant, satisfied, as though she had taken something from me and wasn't the least bit sorry. Daniel's text came just after midnight. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Dinner at my place?" Normally, his words were a source of comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone. But this time, they filled me with unease. Because when I thought of him, I thought of her, standing in the glow of the lamp, draped in the fabric that should have been mine, smiling as though she had already won something I didn't even know I was losing. And that's when darker thoughts began to creep in, unwelcome, but impossible to push away. I thought about the way she lingered too close to Daniel during family dinners, laughing too much at his jokes, brushing her hand against his arm when she thought no one noticed. I remembered the little comments she'd made, offhand, almost careless, but each one now echoing like a warning I had ignored. He deserves someone who really understands him. He shouldn't settle for just anyone. At the time, I had rolled my eyes, brushed it off as my mother's flair for the dramatic. But now, lying awake in the dark, those words didn't feel dramatic at all. They felt dangerous. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen, sipping coffee as though nothing had happened. Her hair was neatly brushed, her silk robe tied perfectly around her waist, her face calm and smug. She looked up at me with a saccharine smile. "Don't look so gloomy, honey. It was just a dress." Her phone buzzed on the counter. Reflexively, my eyes flicked to the screen. And that was when my heart stuttered. It was Daniel's name. She reached out casually, almost lazily, and flipped the phone over so the screen went black. Then she took another slow sip of coffee, her eyes glinting at me from over the rim of the mug. And in that moment, I knew my nightmare had only just begun. The days after that morning blurred together, yet every detail of my mother's expression and the way her fingers lingered over her phone remained etched in my mind like a scar that refused to fade. I told myself I was overthinking, that there had to be an explanation, but deep down I knew there wasn't. I knew that a line had been crossed, even if I didn't yet know how far, and the sick weight in my stomach told me the truth I wasn't ready to speak aloud. There was something between my mother and Daniel. I tried to ignore it at first. I buried myself in work, in planning, in the endless list of wedding details that should have brought me joy: flowers, music, place cards. The cake-tasting Daniel said he was too busy to join. I smiled when my bridesmaids texted, laughed nervously when my aunt asked about the seating arrangements, and nodded through conversations with my father, who seemed blissfully unaware of the tension coiling tighter every time my mother entered the room. Outwardly, I looked like a bride counting down the days. Inwardly, I was unraveling. What hurt the most was how my mother acted as if nothing had happened. She hummed softly while preparing dinner, fussed over floral arrangements, and pretended to beam with pride when she asked me how fittings were going. Every time her phone buzzed, my chest clenched. Sometimes she left the room to answer it. Sometimes she smiled faintly as she typed with quick, deliberate fingers. I told myself it could be anyone. A friend. A cousin. Work. But every time I remembered the glow of Daniel's name on her screen, the excuses withered in my throat. I couldn't tell Daniel. Not yet. Or maybe I was too afraid to. What if I asked, and he laughed at me, accused me of jealousy, or worse, what if he confirmed what I already suspected? So instead, I tested him in small, cowardly ways. I asked him about his day, about who he'd spoken to, about why he hadn't answered my call until later in the evening. And every time, he smiled that easy smile of his, brushed my cheek with his hand, and said, "You worry too much, Em. I'd never hurt you." But his eyes flicked away too quickly when he said it. One evening, about 3 weeks before the wedding, I came home to find the house unusually quiet. My father was working late, as usual, and I assumed my mother had gone to the store. But when I passed her bedroom, the door was open just enough for me to hear her voice, low, warm, carrying that intimate lilt I had only ever heard her use with people she wanted to charm. I froze, my hand on the banister. "You looked so handsome the other night," she whispered. There was a pause, followed by the faint sound of laughter, muffled but unmistakably male. My heart seized. "Of course, I'll see you soon. We'll find a way." The phone clicked. Footsteps moved toward the door, and I darted into the shadows of the hallway, pressing my back against the wall as if I were a stranger hiding in my own home. My mother stepped out of her room, humming softly, her lips curved into the same smug smile I had seen the night she wore my dress. She didn't see me. She didn't know I had heard every word. That night I lay awake in bed, my mind spinning. It could still be nothing, I told myself. Maybe she was speaking to an old friend. Maybe the laugh wasn't Daniel's at all. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality because of stress. But then I remembered the way she had said it. "You looked so handsome." It wasn't the kind of thing you say to a colleague, to a neighbor, to a distant cousin. It was the kind of thing you said to someone you wanted, someone you shouldn't want, someone you were willing to risk everything for. I decided I needed proof. My suspicions alone wouldn't protect me from the storm I felt building on the horizon. The next week, I followed her. Not openly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way you learn to move when desperation and fear drive you more than common sense. She said she was going to a charity meeting at the church, so I left work early, parked across from the hall, and waited. The meeting started at 6. By 7, people began trickling out, chatting in small groups, laughing under the streetlights. My mother wasn't among them. At 7:30, she appeared. But she wasn't alone. Daniel walked beside her, his jacket draped casually over his arm, his head bent close to hers as they spoke. She touched his elbow lightly, in that same too familiar way I had noticed at dinners, and he didn't pull away. They laughed together, their voices low, their bodies leaning toward one another as though they belonged to a world where I did not exist. I felt something inside me fracture. My breath hitched, my hands trembled on the steering wheel, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I wanted to storm across the street, to scream, to demand an explanation that could somehow undo what I was seeing. But I couldn't move. All I could do was watch them disappear into the night, hand brushing against hand, leaving me behind in the shadow of their betrayal. When I finally made it home, hours later, I found my father sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled warmly. "Big day at work, sweetheart?" he asked, oblivious to the way my world was crumbling beneath me. My mother came in shortly after, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly mussed, and she leaned down to kiss my father's forehead before glancing at me across the room. Her eyes lingered on mine, sharp and knowing, as though she could see every suspicion I carried. "Long meeting," she said simply, her voice smooth. But it was worth it. And in that moment, with her eyes fixed on mine, I understood. She knew I was beginning to uncover the truth. By the time the second week rolled around, I couldn't hide from it anymore. The doubt, the gnawing unease, the shadows that had followed me into every room, all of it coalesced into one undeniable truth. My mother and Daniel were betraying me. And yet, even knowing that, I felt paralyzed, as though I had been dropped into some surreal nightmare where every step I took would either confirm my worst fears or destroy what little life I had left untouched. I began noticing the little things with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The way Daniel answered my calls more slowly, his voice slightly strained as if he had been pulled from another conversation. The way my mother's perfume lingered faintly on his jacket one evening when he draped it across the back of a chair. The way their eyes sometimes met across the dinner table, just a second too long, just enough to spark a flicker of heat that I wasn't supposed to see. I wanted to scream at them both, to tear down the thin veil of civility and demand the truth. But another part of me, a quieter, more dangerous part, wanted to wait. To watch. To collect every piece of evidence until there was no way either of them could deny what they had done. Because deep inside, I knew this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about humiliation. My mother wasn't simply stealing my fiancé. She was trying to erase me, to take what was mine and claim it as her own. One night, Daniel invited me to dinner. His apartment had always felt like our shared space, filled with the remnants of our late-night talks, our laughter, our promises whispered in the dark. But that night, something was off. The air felt stale, heavy with a presence I couldn't name. I sat at the table, staring at the plate of pasta he'd prepared, and tried to smile. "This is nice," I said softly, though my hands were trembling beneath the tablecloth. He smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted us to spend some time together. Just us. Just us." The words twisted inside me. I studied him closely, the way his gaze slid away too easily, the faint flush at his throat, the way his phone buzzed twice during dinner, and he shoved it quickly into his pocket. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Who were you with last night?" I asked, my voice low, almost calm. His fork clattered against the plate. "What are you talking about? You weren't at home when I called. You said you were out late. Who were you with, Daniel?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Emily, you've been acting paranoid lately. Stress from the wedding, maybe? You've got to stop this. You're making problems where there aren't any." But his eyes gave him away. He wouldn't meet mine, no matter how long I held his gaze. That night, when he stepped into the bathroom, I picked up his phone. My hands shook as I entered the passcode I had once known so easily. It hadn't changed. The relief was short-lived, though, because as soon as the screen lit up, I saw her name. My mother. Dozens of messages, some deleted but not all. My breath caught as I scrolled. "You looked incredible tonight. Wish we had more time." She has no idea. The room spun around me. My chest tightened until I thought I might suffocate. I dropped the phone onto the table as though it had burned me, my pulse hammering in my ears. When Daniel returned, water still glistening on his hands, he froze at the sight of me standing there, my face pale, my body trembling. He followed my gaze to the phone, and his own face went ashen. "You went through my phone?" he asked quietly, almost accusingly. Tears stung my eyes. "You're sleeping with my mother." The silence that followed was unbearable. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. Instead, he closed his eyes, as if the weight of his own betrayal had finally crashed down on him. "Emily, Don't," I snapped, my voice breaking. "Don't you dare say a word." I grabbed my bag and fled, the walls of his apartment closing in around me like a tomb. I don't even remember driving home. All I remember is the sick feeling in my stomach, the way the headlights blurred through my tears, and the pounding of my heart as though it wanted to tear itself free from my chest. When I finally stumbled through the front door of my parents' house, my father was asleep upstairs. My mother was in the kitchen, sipping tea as though the world were perfectly in order. She looked up at me, her expression calm, almost smug, as if she had been waiting. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked softly. The words sliced through me. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to speak. She smiled faintly, setting her cup down with deliberate grace. "He came to me, you know. He said he was tired of your insecurities, your doubts, your endless questions. He wanted someone who could match him, who could understand him. And I gave him that." My knees nearly buckled beneath me. "You're my mother," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "And you're still a child," she replied smoothly. "You don't know how to hold on to what you want." "But I do." Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but every syllable was a dagger. I turned and fled before I collapsed, stumbling into the night, into the dark street where the air finally felt like it might let me breathe again. That night, I swore to myself that this wouldn't end here. If they thought they could take everything from me, if they thought I would simply disappear into silence, they were wrong. I would find a way to take back my dignity, to expose them both, to make sure the world saw them for what they truly were. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had crossed the point of no return. In the days that followed, I felt like a ghost wandering through my own life. Work meetings passed in a blur, conversations with friends dissolved into meaningless noise, and even the world outside seemed drained of color. But beneath that numbness, something else had taken root, a cold, deliberate anger that burned brighter with every passing hour. Betrayal has a way of hollowing you out, stripping you of everything soft, until all that remains is steel. At first, I thought about running. The urge to pack a bag, to vanish into another city, another state, somewhere no one knew my name, was almost unbearable. But the more I imagined it, the more I realized it would mean giving them exactly what they wanted: silence, absence, erasure. My mother and Daniel would carry on, smug and unchallenged, while I became nothing more than a story they twisted to fit their own narrative. No, I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I started keeping a journal. At first, it was just a way to keep myself from drowning in thoughts I couldn't say aloud, but slowly, it became something else: a record, a weapon, a testament to every detail I noticed, every inconsistency, every lie. I wrote about the way Daniel started showing up to family dinners more often, sitting too close to my mother while pretending to make polite small talk with my father. I described how my mother's laughter carried through the house late at night, muffled by the walls, but unmistakably too warm, too intimate to be innocent. And then there were the photographs. I hadn't planned on taking them. But one evening, after following them again, I parked across from the dimly lit restaurant where they met. They sat in the corner booth, heads bent close, her hand brushing against his as though it was the most natural thing in the world. My hands shook as I lifted my phone, zooming in through the glass, capturing image after image until my storage nearly filled. Proof. Cold, undeniable proof. When I finally confronted Daniel again, it was almost anticlimactic. He didn't yell, didn't plead. He simply stood there in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something that looked almost like shame, but not enough to undo the damage. "How could you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emily, things just happened. She understands me in ways you never did." The words stung more than the betrayal itself. "She understands me." As though I had been a placeholder, a shadow waiting to be replaced. I left without another word, slamming the door so hard the walls seemed to shake. That night, I sat in my car outside my parents' house, staring at the windows glowing softly in the dark. Somewhere inside, my mother was probably waiting for him, probably sipping wine and smiling as though the world had finally bent to her will. The thought made me physically ill. I needed a plan. Not a rash outburst, not some scream into the void that would only make me look hysterical. I needed something that would tear their lies open in a way that couldn't be patched together again. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. My father announced one evening that he wanted to host a dinner, a celebration of the upcoming wedding. Family, close friends, a few neighbors. A gathering of warmth and joy, at least on the surface. I watched my mother's face light up at the suggestion, watched the way Daniel smiled stiffly when my father clapped him on the back. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. For days leading up to the dinner, I played the part of the obedient daughter. I smiled when spoken to, helped arrange the flowers, nodded when my mother instructed me to fetch extra chairs. She seemed almost giddy, unaware of the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. Daniel avoided my gaze, his silence speaking louder than any words ever could. When the night finally arrived, the house was filled with laughter and clinking glasses. My father beamed as he moved from guest to guest, proud and oblivious, while my mother floated around the room in a dress that shimmered under the lights. Daniel stood near the window, drink in hand, looking like a man caught between two worlds. I waited until the plates were cleared, until the conversations began to swell, until every eye was relaxed and every smile seemed genuine. And then I stood, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the folder hidden beneath the table. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "It means so much to celebrate this chapter of my life with all of you. But before we continue, there's something I need to share." The room grew quiet, the laughter fading into uneasy silence. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, her smile faltering, though she masked it quickly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his glass tightening in his grip. I opened the folder. One by one, I laid the photographs on the table, images of them together, heads bent close, hands touching, lips almost meeting. Gasps rippled through the room, the weight of the truth settling like a storm cloud. My father's face drained of color. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling. I met his eyes, my throat thick, but my words clear. "It's the truth. Mom and Daniel have been seeing each other behind my back." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face hardened, her mask slipping as she realized the performance was over. Daniel set his glass down, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of him. My father looked between them, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, and then he pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't say another word. He just walked out, his footsteps heavy, the slam of the front door echoing through the house like a verdict. I stood there, my hands shaking, the photographs still scattered across the table. My mother's eyes met mine, cold and furious, and for the first time, I realized she wasn't ashamed. She was angry, angry that I had dared to expose her. And in that moment, I understood, the battle was far from over. After that night, everything in our family changed. The illusion that had held us together cracked wide open, and there was no way to piece it back. My father didn't come home for 3 days. When he finally returned, his eyes looked older, sunken, as if he had lived a decade in a single weekend. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was only in clipped, practical words. The warmth he once carried into every room was gone. My mother, however, behaved as though nothing had happened. She set the table, brewed tea, scrolled through her phone, and occasionally hummed under her breath. The only difference was her silence toward me. She no longer made passive remarks or offered false smiles. Instead, she ignored me completely, as though I had ceased to exist. And maybe in her mind I had. Daniel tried to call me. Dozens of times. Each message was some variation of apology, excuse, or plea. It was a mistake. She manipulated me. "I still love you." But every time I read his words, I felt nothing but disgust. The man I had once trusted with my whole heart had become a stranger, a stranger who had betrayed me in the most unimaginable way. I never answered. Yet silence wasn't enough. I couldn't simply retreat, licking my wounds, while they carried on in some grotesque parody of happiness. They needed to face consequences, not just privately, but publicly. So I began planning again. The wedding was only 2 weeks away. Technically, it was still on. Guests were still expecting it, deposits had been paid, and the church still held our reservation. My mother, ever determined to save face, insisted we keep up the charade. "We'll handle this quietly," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp. "People don't need to know our business." I stared at her across the kitchen, marveling at her audacity. She had destroyed everything, and yet she still thought she could control the narrative, keep her perfect image intact. That was when the idea formed a final act, one that would tear the mask away for good. On the morning of the wedding, I woke with a calmness that felt almost unnatural. My dress still hung in the closet, untouched since the day I brought it home. I slipped it on, feeling its weight settle over me like armor, not a garment of celebration but of battle. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were steady, my jaw set, my body trembling not with fear but with resolve. At the church, guests filled the pews, whispering in anticipation. The flowers glowed in soft candlelight, the music swelled, and everything looked like a picture pulled from a bridal magazine. My father stood at the back, his face solemn but supportive, his arm steady as he offered it to me. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The doors opened. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as I stepped forward, each footfall echoing against the polished floor. But instead of walking down the aisle, I stopped halfway. I turned to face the guests, my voice ringing clear in the silence. "Before we begin," I said, "there's something you all need to know." I reached into the small clutch I carried, pulling out the folder of photographs once again, along with printed copies of the messages I had found on Daniel's phone. My hands didn't tremble as I held them up for everyone to see. "This wedding will not be happening," I announced. "Because the man you see standing at the altar has been sleeping with my mother." Gasps erupted across the church. Some guests covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. My father closed his eyes, his hand tightening briefly on my shoulder before dropping away. I walked slowly toward the altar, each step deliberate. Daniel's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. My mother sat in the front row, frozen, her mask cracking as whispers swelled around her. "Daniel," I said, my voice calm, "you betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. And Mom, you're supposed to be my protector, my guide, the one person I could always count on. Instead, you became the knife in my back." The silence was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the rustle of papers as I dropped the evidence onto the altar. "This isn't just about me," I continued. "It's about truth. And everyone here deserves to see it." For a long moment, no one moved. And then, quietly, my father stepped forward. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't look at my mother. He simply took my arm, his voice steady as he said, "Let's go, Emily." We walked out together, leaving behind a scene that would ripple through the community for years. The whispers, the stares, the shattered reputations, those were no longer my burden to carry. They belonged to Daniel and my mother, the two people who had thought they could bury their sins in secrecy. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled for them. Daniel lost friends, business connections, respect. My mother became the subject of hushed conversations at church, her once pristine image tarnished beyond repair. Even within our family, cousins and aunts who had once admired her turned away, their eyes filled with disappointment. As for me, I rebuilt slowly. It wasn't easy. The nights were long, filled with memories that clawed at my peace. But each morning, I rose with a little more strength, a little more clarity. I threw myself into work, into friendships I had neglected, into hobbies that reminded me I was more than the sum of their betrayal. One evening, months later, my father and I sat together on the porch, the sky glowing with the soft hues of sunset. He handed me a cup of tea, his voice quiet as he said, "I'm proud of you. You stood tall when others would have crumbled." Tears filled my eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain. They were from the recognition that despite everything, I had survived. I had reclaimed my life, not by clinging to what was lost, but by walking away with dignity. And in that moment, I knew revenge doesn't always come through screaming or breaking. Sometimes it comes through silence, through truth revealed at the right time, through refusing to let your betrayers write the ending of your story. This was my ending, not theirs.